What if I told you there is a man in the Bible who appears in a single paragraph, has no recorded birth, no recorded death, no father, no mother, no genealogy, and yet he becomes one of the most theologically significant figures in all of Scripture? Not a prophet, not a patriarch, not a king of Israel, just a man who walks out of nowhere, does one thing, and then vanishes. And the Bible never quite stops talking about him after that. To understand why this figure matters so much, you need to place yourself inside the ancient Near East, roughly 2000 BCE. This is the world of city-states, where political power and religious authority were almost always held by the same person. A king was not just a ruler. He was a mediator between his people and the divine. The idea of a priest-king was not strange. It was the default. Understanding that default is the key to understanding everything about this man. The figure is Melchizedek. You find him in Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 20. That is it. 3 verses. In the middle of a long battle narrative about Abraham chasing down a coalition of kings who kidnapped his nephew Lot, Melchizedek simply appears. He brings bread and wine. He blesses Abraham. Abraham gives him a tenth of everything. And then the story moves on as if nothing unusual just happened. Except something very unusual just happened. His name is the first clue. Melchizedek in Hebrew is 2 words fused together. Melech means king. Tzedek means righteousness. So his name translates to king of righteousness or righteous king. In the ancient world, names were not just labels. They were descriptions, sometimes aspirations, sometimes theological statements. A name like this, in a text like Genesis, is not an accident. The author wanted you to notice it. He is also identified as King of Salem. Now Salem is almost certainly a reference to what will later become Jerusalem, a city whose name carries the same root as Shalom, meaning peace. So you have a king of righteousness ruling from a city of peace. The symbolism is layered and deliberate. The ancient reader would have felt the weight of those 2 titles stacked together. King of righteousness, King of peace. This is not a random character. This is a carefully constructed figure. The text calls him a priest of Elyon. That phrase, El Elyon, means God Most High. This is significant because El Elyon was a title used in Canaanite religious tradition, not exclusively in Israelite worship. The author of Genesis is making a striking claim here. Melchizedek, a Canaanite priest king who predates the Mosaic covenant, predates the Levitical priesthood, predates virtually every religious institution Israel would later build, is already serving the God Most High. He already knows. He is already there. Then there is the bread and wine. Melchizedek brings these 2 things out to Abraham after the battle. Scholars have debated this detail for centuries. Is this a simple act of hospitality, a victory meal for a weary warrior? Is it a priestly offering? Is it something more? The text does not explain. It just states the fact and moves on. But the combination of bread and wine in a priestly context, offered by a figure of mysterious divine standing, is the kind of detail that later readers would return to again and again. Abraham gives Melchizedek a tithe, 1/10 of everything from the spoils of battle. This is not a small gesture. In the ancient world, giving a tithe to a priest was an act of formal religious acknowledgement. You were saying, I recognize your authority. I recognize the divine institution you represent. Abraham, the founding patriarch of the entire Israelite tradition, submits to this mysterious priest king. That submission is theologically enormous, and the later tradition knew it, and then he is gone. After verse 20 of Genesis 14, Melchizedek does not appear again in the Torah, not in Exodus, not in Leviticus, not in Numbers or Deuteronomy. The entire legal and priestly architecture of the Mosaic covenant is built without a single further reference to him. He comes, he blesses, he receives, he leaves. For a figure this theologically loaded, that silence is almost louder than the appearance itself. The next time Melchizedek appears in the Hebrew Bible is Psalm 110. This psalm is one of the most quoted texts in all of the New Testament, but its origins are in the royal court of ancient Israel. The psalm is addressed to a king, almost certainly a Davidic king, and in verse 4, God swears an oath to this king. The exact words are, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." That line is a theological earthquake. A future king is being compared by divine oath to this ancient mysterious figure. Why does Psalm 110 matter so much? Because it takes Melchizedek out of the historical narrative and turns him into a category, a type, a priestly order that is distinct from the Levitical priesthood. The Levites were the priestly tribe of Israel, descended from Aaron, operating under strict genealogical and legal requirements. The order of Melchizedek is something else entirely. It is older. It is not tied to bloodline. It is established by divine oath rather than inherited duty. That distinction will drive centuries of interpretation. Now, here is where the Dead Sea Scrolls enter the picture. Among the texts found at Qumran between 1947 and 1956 was a document scholars call 11Q Melchizedek. It is a fragmentary text, badly damaged, but what survives is extraordinary. In this Second Temple period document, Melchizedek is not just a historical priest-king. He has become a heavenly figure, an angelic or divine being who will execute judgment at the end of days. The community at Qumran had taken 3 verses from Genesis and built an entire eschatology around them. The 11Q Melchizedek text draws from Isaiah, Leviticus, and the Psalms to construct this portrait. Melchizedek in this document is associated with the year of Jubilee, the ancient Israelite institution of liberation and debt forgiveness. He is described as one who will proclaim liberty to the captives, a phrase drawn directly from Isaiah 61. The Qumran community was reading Melchizedek as a liberating, judging, heavenly figure. This is a dramatic expansion of a 3-verse character, and it tells us how seriously this figure was taken in the Second Temple period. There is also a text from the Nag Hammadi library, the Gnostic manuscripts discovered in Egypt in 1945, that includes a tractate simply titled Melchizedek. In this document, Melchizedek is portrayed as a heavenly high priest who will suffer, be resurrected, and ultimately triumph. The Gnostic tradition had absorbed Melchizedek and transformed him into something that looked remarkably like a Christ figure, independent of the New Testament. This shows you how widely and how deeply this single Genesis character had penetrated ancient religious imagination. But the most sustained and theologically developed treatment of Melchizedek in all of ancient literature is found in the New Testament book of Hebrews. The letter to the Hebrews devotes more space to Melchizedek than any other ancient text. Chapters 5 through 7 of Hebrews build an extended argument using Melchizedek as the central piece of evidence. The author is making a case, a careful, legally structured case, and Melchizedek is the key witness. The author of Hebrews begins in chapter 5 by establishing that Jesus is a high priest, but not a Levitical one. This was a problem for Jewish Christians. If Jesus was the ultimate mediator between God and humanity, how could he be a priest? He was from the tribe of Judah, not Levi. The Levitical law was explicit. Only descendants of Aaron could serve as priests. The author of Hebrews needed a category that could accommodate a priest from outside the Levitical line. Melchizedek was the answer. Hebrews chapter 7 opens with a careful retelling of the Genesis 14 encounter. The author is not just summarizing. He is interpreting every detail with precision. He notes that Melchizedek blessed Abraham, and he draws out the implication: the lesser is blessed by the greater. Abraham, the father of the entire covenant people, received a blessing from Melchizedek. That means Melchizedek occupied a higher priestly station than Abraham himself. And if Abraham is greater than Levi, and Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, then the order of Melchizedek supersedes the Levitical order. Then Hebrews makes its most audacious move. The author points out something that any careful reader of Genesis 14 would notice. Melchizedek has no genealogy. No father is named. No mother is named. No birth is recorded. No death is recorded. In a text like Genesis, where genealogies are almost obsessively detailed, this absence is striking. The author of Hebrews interprets this silence not as a gap in the record, but as a theological statement. Melchizedek, as he appears in Scripture, is without beginning of days or end of life. This argument from silence is one of the most debated moves in all of New Testament scholarship. Is the author of Hebrews making a historical claim that Melchizedek literally had no birth or death? Or is he making a typological claim that the way Melchizedek is presented in the text, without genealogy, makes him a literary type or foreshadowing of a priest whose priesthood is genuinely eternal? Most scholars today read this as typology, a sophisticated literary argument rather than a claim about Melchizedek's literal nature. You will not find this one on a Sunday school poster. The argument in Hebrews is genuinely complex, the kind of reasoning that requires familiarity with Jewish interpretive methods, specifically a technique called Midrash, where the details of a text, including its silences and its word choices, are treated as intentional and theologically loaded. The author of Hebrews is doing Midrash on Genesis 14 and Psalm 110, and doing it at a very high level. This is not simple proof texting. It is a sustained theological argument built on careful textual reading. Philo of Alexandria, the first-century Jewish philosopher, also wrote about Melchizedek. Philo interpreted him allegorically, as he interpreted most of Scripture. For Philo, Melchizedek represented the divine logos, the rational principle that mediates between God and creation. Philo was not a Christian. He was a Jewish philosopher deeply influenced by Platonic thought. The fact that he, independently of the New Testament tradition, was elevating Melchizedek to a cosmic mediating role shows you that this was a figure the ancient world found genuinely compelling. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, also mentions Melchizedek in his work Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus takes a more grounded historical approach. He identifies Melchizedek as the first to build a temple in Jerusalem and credits him with naming the city. For Josephus, Melchizedek is a founder, a historical figure who established the sacred geography of the city that would become the center of Jewish religious life. This is a very different reading from Philo, and it shows you the range of interpretations this single figure could support. The early Christian church fathers were also deeply preoccupied with Melchizedek. Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, Origen in the 3rd, Ambrose and Jerome in the fourth, all of them wrote about this figure. The question they kept wrestling with was the same one the author of Hebrews raised. What exactly is the relationship between Melchizedek and Christ? Are they the same being? Is Melchizedek an appearance of the pre-incarnate Christ, what theologians call a theophany? Or is he a human figure who serves as a type or foreshadowing? There was even a heretical sect in the early church called the Melchizedekians, documented by the church father Epiphanius in the 4th century. This group believed that Melchizedek was a divine power superior to Christ, a heavenly being who was greater than the Son of God. The mainstream church condemned this view, but the fact that a whole sect organized around this one figure from 3 verses in Genesis tells you something important. Melchizedek was not a footnote. He was a live theological battleground. One of the most fascinating interpretive questions is whether Melchizedek was meant to be understood as a historical figure at all, or whether he was always functioning as a literary and theological device. Some scholars in the tradition of source criticism argue that the Melchizedek passage in Genesis 14 is a later insertion, a priestly editorial addition designed to establish the legitimacy of Jerusalem as a sacred site by rooting it in the pre-Israelite past. This is a minority view, but a serious one, and it changes how you read the whole encounter. The connection between Melchizedek and the city of Jerusalem deserves more attention than it usually gets. Salem, the city he ruled, is almost universally identified with Jerusalem by ancient Jewish and Christian tradition. If that identification is correct, then Melchizedek was the priest king of the very ground on which Solomon would later build the temple, on which the second temple would stand, on which, in Christian tradition, the central events of the New Testament would unfold. The geography is not incidental. It is part of the argument. There is also a connection worth exploring between Melchizedek and the concept of the eternal covenant. In Genesis, God's covenant with Abraham is foundational to everything that follows in the Hebrew Bible. Melchizedek appears in the middle of the chapter that immediately precedes the formal establishment of that covenant in Genesis 15. Some scholars read the Melchizedek encounter as a kind of preparatory moment, a divine endorsement of Abraham through an existing priestly authority before the covenant is formally sealed. The bread and wine detail keeps pulling scholars back. In Jewish tradition, the Passover meal and various temple offerings involve bread and wine. In Christian tradition, the Eucharist, the central sacramental act of the Church, is identified with bread and wine. The fact that Melchizedek, this ancient priest of Elyon, offers exactly these two elements in a priestly context has led generations of Christian interpreters to see a deliberate foreshadowing. Whether you read that connection as intentional authorship or retrospective interpretation depends heavily on your theological starting point. Medieval Jewish scholarship also engaged seriously with Melchizedek. Maimonides, the 12th century philosopher and Torah scholar, addressed him in his legal writings. The Talmudic tradition had already debated whether Melchizedek was Shem, the son of Noah, a tradition that attempted to give him a genealogy and anchor him within the known biblical family tree. This identification appears in several Midrashic texts and was widely accepted in certain rabbinic circles, though it is not the dominant scholarly view today. One verse, one name, so much to unpack. The sheer volume of interpretive tradition that has accumulated around 3 verses in Genesis is itself a remarkable phenomenon. You have Jewish apocalyptic texts, Gnostic manuscripts, Platonic allegory, New Testament theology, patristic debate, Rabbinic Midrash, medieval philosophy, and modern source criticism, all circling back to the same brief encounter on a road outside ancient Jerusalem. No other minor character in the Hebrew Bible has generated this density of response. What makes Melchizedek so generative as a figure is precisely his incompleteness. He is a blank space in a very detailed text. The Hebrew Bible is obsessive about genealogy and priestly credentials. Melchizedek has none of that, and yet he is treated with enormous reverence. That tension between his obvious importance and his complete lack of institutional credentials is exactly what makes him useful to every tradition that picks him up. He can be whatever the interpreter needs him to be, and that is not a weakness. It is a kind of theological power. From a purely literary standpoint, Melchizedek functions as what scholars sometimes call a type, a figure whose characteristics and actions anticipate or mirror a later, greater figure. The technique of typology is embedded throughout the Hebrew Bible and was a primary interpretive tool for New Testament authors. Adam is a type of Christ. Isaac is a type of Christ. The Passover lamb is a type. Melchizedek fits this pattern, but he is unusual because he is presented as superior to the founding patriarch rather than simply parallel to a later figure. The question of authorship of Hebrews is itself connected to how we read the Melchizedek argument. For centuries, Hebrews was attributed to Paul, but that attribution has been questioned since at least the 3rd century, when Origen famously said that only God truly knows who wrote it. Modern scholarship is nearly unanimous that Paul did not write Hebrews. The sophisticated rhetorical style, the specific theological concerns, and the extended midrashic argument all point to a highly educated Jewish Christian author, possibly Apollos, possibly Priscilla, possibly someone we cannot name. There is a broader point here about how the canon works. The Bible did not arrive as a finished, unified document. It was assembled over centuries, and the figures within it were interpreted and reinterpreted across that entire process. Melchizedek is a perfect case study in how a single character can accumulate meaning across time. He starts as 3 verses in Genesis. He becomes a royal ideal in the Psalms. He becomes a cosmic judge at Qumran. He becomes a theological argument in Hebrews. Each layer adds something without erasing what came before. What should a careful reader take away from all of this? First, that the apparent simplicity of a short biblical passage is almost never the whole story. The ancient authors were working within rich interpretive traditions, and they expected their readers to bring those traditions to the text. Second, that the silences in Scripture are as meaningful as the words. The absence of Melchizedek's genealogy is not an oversight. It is either a deliberate literary choice or a fact that later interpreters treated as a deliberate literary choice. Either way, it does enormous work. The Bible remembered them. History forgot. Let us fix that. Melchizedek is not forgotten exactly, but he is consistently underestimated. Most people who have read through the Bible know the name. Far fewer have stopped to ask why this figure appears where he does, why the text gives him no genealogy, why Abraham of all people submits to him, and why a single verse in a psalm written centuries later would become the theological cornerstone of an entire argument about priesthood and covenant. Those questions are worth sitting with. If this kind of deep dive into a figure most people walk past is what you are here for, then you are in exactly the right place. Every video on this channel is built around the same conviction, that the people who appear briefly in that ancient text were not placeholders. They were not filler. They were somebody's whole life, and sometimes, like Melchizedek, they became something far larger than any single life. Subscribe if you want to keep going. There are so many names left to unpack, and I am not done looking.